on Citizenship and Immigration to order. We are continuing pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the study of migration challenges and opportunities for Canada in the 21st century. We've had one change today with respect to the first hour. Mr. Youssef Aria has had to cancel due to personal illness. So we have Ms. Bond with us. Thank you for coming. I'm going to suggest that we do a 50-minute hour and then move to the second panel and just save a bit of time at the end of the meeting for an in-camera meeting. So we'll take that 10 minutes that we're not having that second presentation. Thank you for agreeing to join us today as we're looking at a very broad study on migration challenges. We're doing it in a way that's not exactly linear. We have a variety of issues coming at us, and we'll make sense out of them, hopefully, after the testimony has continued for a while. So this is your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you and good afternoon. My apologies for sort of screeching in here. I mistakenly went to center block and cleared security procedures there before making my way here. So my apologies, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be with you today. My name is Jennifer Bond, and I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa and managing director of the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub. I'm also currently serving as chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. I plan to focus my intervention today on two things. First, the potential of community sponsorship programs to both protect refugees and transform in very fundamental ways the world's approach to resettlement. And second, Canada's unique opportunity to lead this transformation. Now, I know you've already heard from a number of other witnesses on the scale and scope of the displacement challenges in the world today, so I'll just open with a few key framing remarks. First, we're facing a dramatic escalation in the number of people being forcibly displaced. And you've heard the numbers when our colleagues from the UNHCR were before you. They're enormous. Second, the global community has failed to mobilize sufficient collective capacity to adequately protect all of these people, particularly since they need protection for longer periods of time than ever before. Third, many governments and their citizens have serious concerns about how these large protection challenges intersect with their ability to effectively integrate newcomers so that they enhance existing societies. And fourth, we have to all recognize this, when integration fails, communities suffer, anti-immigrant sentiment festers, and support for the broader protection agenda is challenged. So it's a very complex and a very challenging moment. But over the past 40 years, Canada has been quietly developing an incredibly powerful tool that has the potential to make an enormous difference, and that is community sponsorship. Sponsorship is a program or an idea that many of you know well. Many of you have grown up with it all around you in various ways, and a lot of us take it for granted. It's part of what we understand as a normal component of refugee resettlement. Until very recently, however, we were the only country in the world with any kind of sustained and robust policy model that gives private citizens primary responsibility for welcoming and integrating refugees into their local communities. The only country in the world. Most Canadians don't know that. They don't know how unique this program is. We introduced community sponsorship in the late 1970s, and since that time, Canadians have sponsored over 300,000 refugees, on top of those who have been resettled by our government programs. This includes over 30,000 Syrians who have arrived to sponsorship groups in over 400 Canadian communities since 2015 alone. Canada's use of private sponsorship today has a number of different individual programs. Private sponsorships, which is language with which many of you will be familiar, BVOR sponsorships, LGBTQ sponsorships, medical sponsorships, educational sponsorships. We have a lot of different program streams. And each of those is driven by its own unique policy configurations. But at the heart of all of them is this fundamental notion that it's groups of citizens that are empowered and responsible for welcoming and integrating the newcomers. That's at the heart of all of those programs. And collectively, these programs demonstrate three important things. First, that community-sponsored refugees integrate comparatively quickly, showing improved outcomes over all kinds of indicators in years 1, 3, and 5 post-arrival. And it isn't really surprising if you think about the many benefits that follow when you have a group of 10 or 20 or even 50 people dedicated to helping you find your way in your new neighborhood. And of course, the forms of this support are many. It includes finding and furnishing housing, providing informal language training over a cup of coffee or a shared meal, introducing newcomers to their neighbors, a local barber, helping kids with homework, teaching them how to skate, supporting adults with resume writing and landing their first jobs. And it's all of these little things that make a difference in the lives of newcomers. From a policy perspective, what matters is that the sponsors themselves feel deeply invested in and responsible for the success of their new neighbors. And it stops being watching from a distance, and maybe even hoping for the best from a distance for your new neighbors, and instead it's a collective endeavor. Your new neighbor's success is also your success, and that changes the landscape of what this looks like. The data shows us it also changes outcomes for refugees. Second, this is really important, community sponsorship has a profoundly positive impact on local communities. And if you talk to sponsors here in Canada, they almost always talk about how meaningful sponsorship has been for them. They talk about how it's brought their communities together, how it's addressed their own sense of detachment and loneliness in a chaotic and technology-driven world. They talk about how fulfilling the experience was. The key thing is it's always about them. It's not actually about the fact that they did something good for the world. It's about how their lives have been improved. And this is really noteworthy in the context in which we're facing the bigger problems around displacement. It's also noteworthy that sponsorship programs have the potential to engage many different kinds of communities. And we know that from our experiences here in Canada, where big law firms have engaged in sponsorship, neighborhood book clubs have engaged in sponsorship, entire rural towns, various faith communities, interfaith communities. This is an opportunity to engage lots of different kinds of communities. And of course, it's not only the sponsors themselves who are engaged, but also the people who are around them. And that's really part of the magic of these programs. It's the people who get asked for a car seat or a couch or a few hours of their time, not from a stranger or a professionalized agency, but from their friends, from their neighbors. They feel compelled to contribute. So we know from recent survey data that close to 2 million Canadians have been part of sponsorship groups just in the last 3 years. That's extraordinary when you consider our population, 2 million Canadians. But I find equally stunning that another 7 million Canadians know someone who has sponsored and have offered them some forms of support. Again, extraordinary reach. And this brings me to my third significant benefit. Over time, sponsorship has the potential to translate block by block, community by community, town by town, a mobilization that begins in the most intimate of ways. It's about helping a particular family find their way in this new country. And you can take that mobilization and see it translate into strengthened understanding and support for the broader protection agenda. And in today's complex and challenging environment, that support is critically important. It's a critical part of what we have to address when we look at the big picture issues that you have all been studying. Belief that community sponsorship can lead to these three significant outcomes has led to the creation of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, or GRSI, a unique partnership that brings together the Government of Canada, the UNHCR, the Justra Foundation, the Open Society Foundations, and the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub. And you have in front of you samples of some material that's been produced through that partnership. Our collective goal is to encourage and support the adoption of community sponsorship programs all over the world. And there is tremendous interest. As I sit here today, the GRSI is currently working in over 15 countries that are interested in exploring the possibility of sponsorship programs. And we're also supporting the design and implementation of publicly announced programs in the UK, Argentina, Ireland, New Zealand, Germany, and Spain. And that's an interesting list of countries, in part because of its diversity. Hundreds of sponsored refugees are already arriving in several of these countries, and we anticipate that by the end of next year, there will be tens of thousands of sponsors directly supporting refugees all over the world for the first time outside of Canada. The UK is leading in this regard, and I was recently at an event in London that gave me an opportunity to hear some of the same kind of stories that have surrounded us for decades in Canada, except they were being shared with Welsh, Irish, Scottish, and Cockney accents. And I have to say, it was such a meaningful demonstration of what can happen if we find the right policy tools to empower our communities. Communities have a lot of skills, a lot of energy, and a lot of compassion. At this moment of significant challenge, we have to empower them. Sponsorship and the GRSI have been named by UN member states in the final draft of the Global Compact on Refugees. And the international community is currently looking very actively for new approaches to the massive displacement problems that you have been looking at. They see hope in sponsorship. They are interested in sponsorship. And they are looking to Canada to lead the way. So what can we do? And I'll close on this point. We need to share our 40 years of experience generously, with humility, and also honestly. We need to talk about what hasn't gone that well. We need to also grow our commitment to capacity building around these programs, finding significant ways not just to describe what we do here, but to roll up our sleeves and offer expertise and operational support and sustained accompaniment as states transform their own approaches to welcoming newcomers. What we take for granted is a huge radical leap in most of these countries. We also need to find ways to build connections between sponsorship groups in Canada and those that are forming all around the world, so that we can leverage the community-based expertise and generosity and energy and skills that is at the heart of our program here as we're trying to support others in developing these programs in new places. Most importantly, we need to recognize the transformative potential of a model that for us is normal. And I welcome the study that you're undertaking here for that reason. It's an opportunity to see what we do well and the spaces where Canada can lead, and this is one of them. Canada is a trailblazer in the sponsorship space. We've been quietly doing what we've been doing for 40 years, but now the world is asking for us to play a leadership role. And given the scope and the complexity of the challenges that the international community is facing, there's a significant opportunity and a real responsibility for Canada to stand up and seize that moment. So many thanks again for the invitation to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Ms. Zahid.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Bond, for your testimony, and thank you for all the work which you have done. We have heard from some of our previous witnesses in regards to this study about the relationship between the legal and the irregular migration channels, and how cutting down on the availability of the regular and legal migration streams usually lead to an increase in migrants seeking irregular channels. So often at great risk and cost. So can you please discuss about the relationship between the legal and the irregular channels, and are there any legal channels that can be made so that we can discourage the irregular channels?
Great, thank you. And I will leave to others who have done more quantitative studying of what happens as we start to move different policy levers as they respond to each other. And I'll restrict my comments here to note that there is an interest at the global level in trying to expand resettlement capacity for two main reasons. The first is there are urgent lives at stake. And when the international community as a whole doesn't come together to figure out how to protect those lives, desperate people start to move on their own. So there is a widespread recognition that if channels aren't created, regularized, safe, available channels for people who are desperate to save their lives and protect their families, there will be increasing pressures on the other forms of movement. And that is part of what's reflected in the Global Compact on Refugees. You see states looking for solutions that will try to avoid the pressures that come with irregular forms of migration. The second, and I really want to emphasize this, is there are a small number of states in the world who are hosting the vast majority of the 25 million refugees. And you've heard about this. I understand you've visited some of these places. There is an intense pressure in those countries on their systems, on their populations, on their communities. And they are looking for support from the international community to recognize that this is a global problem, a global challenge that needs global solutions. So resettlement is not only about creating channels, it's not only about saving lives, it's also about participating as an active member of the international community and signaling solidarity with the states who are hosting the vast majority of the world's displaced persons. So those are two main reasons to do resettlement generally. Now, sponsorship, I would suggest to you, has a third benefit. And the third benefit is this change in the hosting populations. So we're not only resettling, we're also supporting the communities who are welcoming the newcomers. And that, over time, changes the fabric of those communities and eventually of the countries in a way that supports the whole protection agenda, including for people who arrive through irregular channels.
Resettlement is not always an answer, and with high numbers of IDPs and refugees, we have heard. What do you think Canada can take some other measures other than resettlement?
Sorry, take some of this, sorry.
What measures Canada can take other than resettlement to help the increasing number of the refugees and the IDPs?
Well, I think there are a number of different steps which states have identified as being supportive to a comprehensive solution. Some of those include investing in those states which are doing the vast majority of hosting. And we know there's continuous budget deficits through all of the international agencies who are offering support in those states. I think looking very significantly at the humanitarian envelopes, at the development envelopes, and identifying how that support can be offered is significant. As you know, the challenges around IDPs are different because they have not crossed an international border. So there's a series of challenging questions for the international community around IDPs, including who is best positioned to support them and what are the politics around that support. But I think that's a discrete population that we also need to consider, and I know you've had some experts in front of you on the IDP issue. And I think that all states recognize they also do have to take a look at their own integration efforts. These programs, our ability to welcome newcomers successfully, depend on investments in integration. And that is a place where Canada is a leader. We invest a lot in integration, and a place where we can offer a lot of support to the international community as it starts to consider how to expand the responses.
I understand that you were involved in some of the deliberations around the Global Compact on migration. So can you please discuss some of the measures included in the compact design to encourage some safe and legal immigration?
I want to clarify, I was not part of the negotiation of the compact. The compact originated in a state-led process in combination with the UNHCR. So the UNHCR has tabled for states a series of drafts, and the global community has had an opportunity through a series of consultations in Geneva to input. So I have not been a part of that. I have followed the process closely, and as I've tabled here today, some of my work on sponsorship is reflected in the final draft that has been negotiated between states and agreed to by the UNHCR.
Are there any legislative or regulatory changes Canada should consider to discourage irregular migration?
I do understand that your study includes a number of topics, including the domestic asylum system, as well as the international contributions. And I've really come here today to speak specifically on the global contributions and not focus on the detailed legislative changes around our own asylum processes. So I'll defer to some of your other experts on that point.
Mr. Tilson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that you're emphasizing your position, your comments are with respect to the international issue, but in doing that, you must have looked at the local sponsorship programs And I'd like to ask you a question with respect to the wait times of the approval of sponsorship groups, and secondly, refugee funding. And as I understand it, sponsorship groups can apply to something called blended visa office referral, which I don't know much about, and hopefully you can tell us. So they do all the pre-screening, and they prepare to have the refugee confirmation ready. So ultimately, the sponsors have to be approved, and then that's it. The refugee gets assigned to them and is on their way. So I've heard of files taking, with respect to this process, 1 to 4 months or even 6 to 12 weeks. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that, as opposed to the current of 1+ a year wait times, which sponsorship groups are currently experiencing. So, as I understand it, the government is committed to taking 1,500 claims per year and is currently 500 short, as they need more sponsors. So the government looks after the first 6 months of refugee funding, and then I understand there's some Jewish organization who's committed to looking after the second 6 months of expenses. So the sponsorship group, therefore, if that's the case, would not have to worry about the costs for the first year. So I don't know how familiar you are with this blended visa office referral, but if you can enlighten us, I'd appreciate it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take that question in 2 parts because I am both familiar with the BVOR program, very unfortunately named program, which we refer in short as BVOR, as a policy mechanism within the Canadian landscape. And I'm also very involved in the private sector funding that you referred to, which for a time-limited moment is subsidizing the sponsor's part of that program. So I'll tackle both of those pieces. So the first question that you asked is about how the BVOR program works and how it's different in its operational dimensions to what we call often the private sponsorship program. I prefer to call the naming program to be very clear on what's different. So in the private sponsorship program or the naming program, individual Canadians or groups of Canadians are able to identify the individual person somewhere in the world who they wish to sponsor. And they put that name and position a series of documents to show why that person should be coming in as a refugee. And the Government of Canada then takes responsibility to find that person anywhere in the world, conduct a series of interviews, assess whether they're a refugee, and if they are, and if the sponsorship group is approved, they will be able to come through as a sponsorship. I'll contrast that with the BVOR program, which begins with a UNHCR referral to the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada then does its screening, its decision whether this is a refugee that meets Canadian criteria, also does medical screening, also does security and health screening. And then that person is offered to sponsorship groups within Canada who are interested in sponsoring. So because of that very different back end, there's a different operational timeline that's required between when an application to sponsor is received and when a sponsorship a landing can actually happen. In the one variant, the refugee is pre-approved before she is introduced on paper to the sponsorship group. And in the second variant, a name appears to the Government of Canada, and using their visa offices, they go and find and start the process of screening. So it's very different from an operational perspective. The other thing that's very different in Canada at the moment is there's a huge demand to do named refugee cases. And we refer to that as the echo effect. There's a lot of people who have arrived in Canada in the last few years who have left loved ones behind, and they are currently asking either their own sponsorship groups or others in the community who they encourage to form sponsorship groups to bring their loved ones to safety. So because of the echo effect, we've had a surge of applications in through this naming program. A lot of those cases we expect will be family reunification cases, and that has put a lot of demand on an already slower operational model. So you're absolutely right. The difference in timing is significant, and we see wait times of 3 to 5 years, depending on the location of the named refugee in the named model, and we see landing times of a few weeks in the BVOR model. So it's absolutely very different. To speak to your second question on this current moment for Canada's BVOR program, there has been a lot of interest in Canada in retaining this very dynamic sponsorship model, and there is a multi-year wait list that reflects that. But there has been less interest, I think both less awareness and less interest in taking BVOR-sponsored refugees just over the last short term of time. And there's a number of theories about that, including the fact that the echo effect has encouraged sponsors to support loved ones of people already here. We can explore that further if it's of interest. In response to that, a number of community organizations have looked at ways of encouraging use of the BVOR program and educating Canadian sponsorship groups about the availability of the program. One of those interventions has been led by my organization, the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub, and we partnered with a number of philanthropists who offered to subsidize the sponsor portion of the sponsorship, because you correctly identified a second difference in the BVOR program. Sorry, I skipped over that. In the naming variant, the sponsor bears the responsibility for 100% of the settlement costs for the first year. And in the BVOR program, that's split 50-50 between the sponsors and the Government of Canada. So the 50% that's borne by the sponsorship group is for a time-limited period being fully subsidized by a group of philanthropists through our organization and a partnership with the Jewish Family Services, who is working with us on this. And that has mobilized a long wait list of BVOR sponsors. So where we started a few weeks ago thinking there's a shortage in that space, it's now a long list of people waiting to support BVOR-sponsored refugees, and we have some work to do now to unpack what that tells us about the operational models and the strains on the system.
The question was so good, and the answer was even better. I'll let you go on a little long.
No, I think she's done an excellent job in explaining it to me. I must confess, I until recently had never heard of this BVOR program, and if your organization is involved in that, congratulations, because the wait times, it does seem to solve the wait times, although I suppose if it becomes more popular, it won't.
That's right.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman.
Thank you. Mrs. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Bond, for your work in the community and for being here as a witness today at the committee. On the issue around the refugee sponsorship program, as you've noted, there are many, many people who actually in Canada who are very generous and who want to engage in that sponsorship opportunity. And however, there are limitations because they can't actually get a family here, and they've been waiting and waiting and waiting. So to that end, I wonder if you have any recommendations for the government in terms of direct policy action that can be taken to address this issue. That's my first question.
Great, thank you. And I think while I have explained the operational complexities of the naming program, I do share concern that there is a lot of goodwill and compassion in Canadian communities. There's a lot of Canadians who have fundraised, they have the money available and the interest in sponsoring, and they're being frustrated by the very long wait times. So I do think it's incumbent on the government to consider what it can do. A number of options. One is to invest in those processing capacities. So to the extent it's an operational barrier, there's obviously ways of increasing our operational capacity. Second is there is, as you know, a levels target, which sets a cap on the number of people who are able to come through sponsorships. There are cost components to sponsoring. There are a variety of operational components, but that cap could ultimately be lifted in a way which would mobilize and facilitate the ongoing interest by these groups. I'm concerned that frustrating the sponsorship groups by having them wait 3, 4, 5 years is actually very counterproductive. And the last thing that I'll mention is I do think it is an opportunity to educate Canadians about the other streams available. In addition to the BVOR program, there's a number of other sponsorship-related opportunities that don't involve naming a refugee. Some Canadians just don't know about them. So I think doing a better job at educating about that range of streams might diversify the interests in a way that is beneficial for all of our overall policy objectives.
Thank you. This is what I've heard from the community as well, calling on the government to lift the cap, because that is very, very essential, because effectively the cap is limiting the capacity of Canadians' generosity in this effort. And so I'm hearing from you that that's something that the government should do. And the other one, of course, in tandem with that is the levels numbers. The levels numbers has to match, because if it doesn't match, without one or the other, it doesn't actually work. And then lastly, on the question around processing, you're absolutely right. Capacity in processing is key. The government has said, for example, for a spousal sponsorship, a 12-month period for processing. Would you suggest that that should be the target to which the government should place for this work, for this stream?
Well, I think there are some significant operational challenges associated with refugee-related sponsorships. In part, the geographic location of some of these people is quite precarious. So we have difficulty accessing some parts of the world where people have named a refugee. So it's harder to create a target, a processing target, in the same way as it is in other streams where the application is more paper-based. But I certainly do think investments in that operational capacity will allow us to realize a better average processing time, which would be welcome.
Yeah, in the instance where, in the difficult locations, in some cases where there's not even a processing office there to process that work, the government has engaged in the past, utilizing the UNHCR, the IOM, and other agencies, international agencies that are reputable to do that work. In fact, in some of the previous cases with Syrian refugee initiatives on the privately sponsored stream, the former minister actually embarked in that process to get some of the folks processed accordingly so that they can finally get to Canada for resettlement. So those are the options to which the government can engage in to make this work in a much more speedier way. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. I think there are a multiplicity of costs that are associated with increasing the processing capacity that need to be carefully weighed against the incredible resources that are mobilized in our community. So there's millions of dollars, and a lot of Canadians very anxious to engage in supporting refugees at a time when there's clearly this overwhelming need. So figuring out how to leverage that investment and that energy and that compassion in our communities, I think supports looking at creative models in the way that you're describing.
In your presentation, this is something we've heard from the refugees themselves. In the way in which they describe their family unit is very different, what they consider as their immediate family, than the Western society's consideration. But yet, with their application for family reunification is very limited, because it's limited to spouse, to children, underage children, I should say, and then also parents, grandparents, and to which there are streams to accommodate that. So for a lot of the refugees, siblings, for example, would not be included in that. If they have an adult child who has a separate family, and if they weren't in the original application, they're not included in the family reunification stream and so on. Would you think that is wise for the government to consider really making changes to what we defined as family, especially in light of the circumstances of how our communities are changing in our global context, and to and look at our immigration policy in that regard?
One of the things that's happened with the sponsorship stream in particular is this overwhelming use of naming sponsorship cases for those extended family members who aren't able to come through other family reunification mechanisms. So I think that the challenge that every country is facing right now is the incredible pressure caused by 25 million refugees, figuring out from a policy perspective which of that population we're aiming to support on a priority basis. There's obviously significant need. So I'm conscious of the incredible desire of people who are here to reunify with their families. And of course, there's many heartbreaking stories, and those stories are mobilizing sponsorship groups to name family members, and they're also creating pressure in our other family reunification streams. However, we have to be mindful that we are also looking for UNHCR referral spaces. This is a different population, non-family linked cases, where there's an urgent need to move from the basis of some vulnerability. And I think there are persuasive policy arguments on the need to also ensure that there's a lot of attention being paid to that stream. So I don't want to suggest that the policy of family reunification should be a priority without also looking at the need to look at UNHCR referrals. Some people will make an argument for economic, for refugees who are going to integrate more quickly because they are be economic drivers. Others will make a very strong policy case for looking at LGBTQ, for women at risk, for special interest groups. So I'm very conscious of the myriad of policy tensions and the need for a thoughtful consideration of how they work together.
I'm just,
Okay.
sorry.
I'll give
I'm
you
just
a
gonna-
little quick one.
Sorry. I'm actually talking about an immigration stream and not refugee stream resettlement for family reunification. Canada used to have a program that allowed for immigration streams for family reunification for siblings, for example. That's how my family came, by the way. But that policy no longer exists. You cannot make an application from a sibling for family reunifications purposes. So if we were to allow for that kind of stream to be reopened, would that not alleviate the pressures for the refugee stream?
Very briefly.
I'm going to revert to my previous answer. I agree with you on the family reunification point. I'll just point to the fact that there's a tremendous number of policy drivers that are being balanced, not only within the refugee policy, within the immigration policy. So I agree with you on the need to look at family reunification, but I think we need to do that in conjunction with looking at our approach to all of the streams, including the humanitarian streams, which are equally important and need to be considered in their own right.
Thank you. Just before Mr. Ayub begins, I'm going to slip in a question here. And it's on terminology, because I notice your terminology, and I've had trouble with terminology. And pulling back, we had a witness at not this study, but a previous study we did, who expressed grave concerns about the privatization of our refugee sponsorship program as though that were negative. And your use of the word community, it seems very intentional, as opposed to private. We've called them PSRs, private, community, naming, or named, all those kinds of names. You've chosen community because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems because of the benefit that's conferred on both the refugee and the community. Am I right on that?
So the community language is definitely what's being used in the global context. The reference to privatization is private refugees is quite unique to Canada, and I think it is a more accurate term. It's not about who pays. That's not about privatizing the cost in the way that term suggests. It's about engaging community and engaging broadly a wide range of citizens.
Okay. And we'll come up with a better BVOR because the emphasis on the visa officer has always bothered me. It doesn't make any sense. But we'll work. I just don't like that name. And GAR is a terrible name.
Yes.
So one of the recommendations I'm hoping the committee can work on is get better terminology because it maybe is important. Hmm? Yeah. Mr. Ayub.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. In your introduction, you said there was an opportunity for Canada to show leadership internationally. Something that we're doing in the right way, I believe. At the same time, however, we're very critical about our own procedures. I'm from Quebec, where there's been even greater pressure in recent years. I would say that we are as generous as we are concerned. There is with regard to the public program and the private program, how, in your view, do they perform in terms of integrating new arrivals? Which is the better route, in your view, private or public? Do they interact? Do they overlap? Does one cannibalize the other? Should we put more effort into private or public, or vice versa? I'll answer in English if I may. Thank you for your question.
And the question to be about the balance between publicly supported and privately sponsored or community-sponsored refugees. And I think the data clearly shows that community-sponsored refugees do better on a variety of integration outcomes, and we get this really important impact on our communities. So my first answer is robust community engagement is a good model, and we should be very dedicated in Canada and globally to trying to get more communities involved rather than tightly held, professionalized, government-funded models. Having said this, as with any policy, there's a whole bunch of pieces that have been put together in Canada. And currently, Canada does most of its UNHCR referred refugees through a government-supported model. And I don't want to suggest that my preference for broad community engagement is also a preference for named refugees over UNHCR referred refugees. So I want to distinguish those elements of the Canadian program, and I think it's clear that engaging citizens is very positive. I don't think that necessarily means the front-end stream has to be aligned the way it currently is in Canada.
Est-ce que dans l'avantage du côté privé, c'est
Is the advantage of a private-sponsored, for private-sponsored refugees, is it in the same way a disadvantage as well, because people select family members or friends to sponsor? At the same time, that prevents the sponsorship of refugees who don't have the good luck to have friends or family in Canada and are therefore not selected. A refugee program targets people in distress. We talked about timelines. My community, that is, welcomed a refugee family recently. It took 2.5 years, and we're still waiting for others. We are hearing some hopeful things, but many are losing hope. They're even leaving refugee camps because life there is too difficult. It's just an endless cycle. They have to keep restarting the process, and there are some people we simply never see getting through it. How do we assess whether the program is performing well? What criteria do we use to determine whether a program is successful, be it on the private sponsorship side or the public sponsorship side? What should we be working on?
Quick answers to those helpful comments. The first is that in most of the other countries I mentioned, naming or selection is not a feature of the sponsorship model. So in the United Kingdom, in Germany, which is not yet online but will be with a 500-person pilot, in Argentina, in Ireland, soon to be online, they will be taking UNHCR-referred refugees and putting them into sponsorship groups in the same way we do with our BVOR program. So they are taking the BVOR part of Canada's program and putting that as version of it into their own communities. So all of this is to say, I don't think that the benefits of sponsorship are contingent on choice. I think there's a number of other policy discussions around whether choice is useful, particularly to accomplish policy goals like family reunification, where there's a lack of other infrastructure. But I want to separate that conversation from the conversation of the benefits of engaging community. Second point was around how to measure success. It's an excellent question. There have been imperfect metrics that vary significantly by country. Is integration success about employment? Is it about early employment? Is it about language acquisition? Is it about how the kids are doing in school? Is it about whether the family is out in the community and engaging? And if so, how do we measure all of these things? Very active debate. People agree that Canada is a world leader in integration, but when you actually look at the metrics being used, it's apples to oranges in many different jurisdictions. What I will say is that I think sponsorship forces us to add a different series of questions, not only around what is integration, but also what has been the degree of community acceptance and what has the experience of the community been. So when we've been looking at the introduction of sponsorship programs globally and then considering what's happening in Canada as part of that work, we're interested in not only counting resettlement spaces, but also counting the number of people who have been touched in a positive way by supporting the newcomer. And that is a different way of conceiving resettlement, and I want to emphasize from my opening comments, this is something that Canada has been doing and no one else has been doing. When we look at the collapse of the U.S. resettlement system at this moment, the lack of community engagement has been a crippling component of what is happening there. So in Canada, there's these 2 to 10 million people who are engaged in refugee protection. The United States has had a much bigger, a much more professionalized system and has had a fraction of the number of people engaged, and that's been a real weakness of that system. So I want to emphasize metrics not only about refugee success, but also around community success. Do our communities welcome this, and are they being supported in this act of welcome and integration?
Thank you. Mr. Maguire.
Mr. Chair, just wanted to say as well, thank you for your presentation. Most enlightening. You worked with the Global Refugee Supportive Initiative here, and you've, out of that, I understand that there was a guidebook created in that area. I'm wondering if you can just tell us what kind of connections you've had with those sponsorship groups that have, how many have used the guide, or how is it being used, and have you heard of any private, or let's call them community, sponsorship groups, and what have you connected with them on those areas?
Great. So the guidebook is a creation of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative that tries to break down the magic of sponsorship into dozens and dozens and dozens of questions for other countries to look at when they consider these programs. And if you haven't seen it, you're very welcome. It's available on refugeesponsorship.org in 4 languages. To answer the question, the viewership is around 25,000 on that site. And we know that the average length of stay on the guidebook is close to 45 minutes, which is quite long for a website. We did develop the guidebook in consultation with community stakeholders, including a wide consultation with community groups across the country. That's where the expertise on these programs really lies, and we benefited from their feedback in all parts of that process.
Just a quick one. Can you give us an example, or a couple of the examples of the I guess the challenges that they face in sponsoring refugees? I'm sure you may have addressed that in the book.
Sure, sponsorship is hard. It's very human work. Sponsorship groups often experience cross-cultural exchange issues. There's often surprise at the lack of excitement that newcomers will feel after their initial month here. You know, months 2, 3, 5, 6 can be really hard, and sponsorship groups don't know how to handle that. Sponsorship groups struggle with language, where there's big language acquisition gaps. Sponsorship groups struggle with dealing with people who have been deeply traumatized. The benefit of the program is team problem solving and wide community support in solving those issues together. And we see thousands of different solutions being developed by sponsorship groups themselves as they face each of those hurdles.
Yeah, I have been very involved in at least one, and knowledge of more community groups that have, in groups of 5 or other groups that have sponsored and worked with refugees and immigrants coming into Canada. Big difference there. But some of the wait times have been a long time. You referred to that earlier. we've seen people coming in from Yemen taking up to 7 years. Can you just elaborate on obviously I think the experience I've had and what you've indicated is with community sponsorships, that wait time is cut way down. Can you just elaborate on your thoughts on why and what we can do better with some of the government-implemented ones?
So I just want to make sure I understood the question in terms of the sponsorship wait times being 7 years. How I think I partially addressed this question and also agreed with some of the suggestions of your colleague, Ms. Kwan, on improving some of the operational capacity. It is absolutely right that some geographical areas are underserviced by Canadian visa offices, and investing in getting resources there, getting people there on rotation more quickly. These are operational fixes which would solve that. I think we've also talked about the need to look at the way that operational capacity sits against the parliamentary approved targets. I see those as the two primary barriers to decreasing wait times.
Thanks. And we've heard that there's been some lack of communication in some areas on government-sponsored refugees, and I'm just wondering if you can offer us some solutions on that. The community options are great, but what can we do with some of the other areas?
So I think the government-assisted refugee program in Canada is also one of the best in the world. We do have a lot of investment in integration supports, which are available to all immigrants, including our government-assisted refugees. One of the things that has happened in recent years since the surge in Syrian arrivals in 2015 is a lot of innovation at the community level and subsequently some government investment in that innovation, including figuring out how to take the best parts of sponsorship and try to provide them to government-assisted refugees. So there's some interesting pilot programs now that try to match, sponsorship group type communities around government-assisted refugees, because my own view is there's no substitute for that very direct, multiplicity of supports. We can invest in other kinds of supports, but nothing's going to change having a neighbor that wants to help you.
We're out of time. I'm going to give my colleague a question.
Yeah, good afternoon. I just came back last week from visiting a refugee camp in Beirut, in Lebanon. The Syrian refugee camp as well. I was in Amman, met with the refugee families. We met with families, and one of the concerns, some of the families have been approved to come to Canada, and they'll be located in Ottawa. That same exact family doesn't want to come to Ottawa, wants to go to Winnipeg, where they have family members or community members that they know. And now the dilemma is that the decision being made to be located in Ottawa for that same exact family. What is the solution to cases like this, in your opinion?
It's a great question. We refer to it as the problem of destining. Where is the destination for the refugee? There's a different approach in Canada for government-assisted refugees than for sponsored refugees. Government-assisted refugees are generally destined to whatever city they have indicated where there's a family tie or any other tie, a friend or some other connection. Sponsorship is a little more challenging because you obviously need to be destined to the city where your sponsorship group is located. And that does create a tension for some newcomers who are desperate, of course, for a new opportunity to get out of a terrible situation. But if the sponsorship group is not in the same location as their family member, that can create a tension. In Canada, there is a policy not to match the UNHCR referred refugee to a sponsorship group away from the family members, recognizing that tension. But where it's a named case, it's really beyond the control of the policy-making branch. It sits with the sponsorship group and the newcomers to try to triangulate that tension.
Should the policy change by any chance or be updated?
Well, the current Canadian policy for both the sponsored referred refugees and the government-assisted refugees is to take into account in destining decisions the location of any family or close personal links.
Thank you. Mr. Sarai.
Bond, it's quite enlightening to find out that we in Canada have one of the best and most unique systems, and it's actually great to know that over 300,000 have come through that system. One of the challenges we've seen in various studies here is that when we have selection based, and I'm not critical of the system, but I'm worried. Usually, communities tend to, not all of them, a lot of them invite refugees from various cultures and different religions and different groups. But a lot of times, we culturally pick out ones that are more close to us, and what happens is those with support networks in Canada get invited, but those that might be more vulnerable get left behind because they have perhaps maybe no connection in Canada. An example were like the Yazidis. They had no roots here, so there's nobody really calling for them except for one or two groups. So how do you balance that in comparison to government-sponsored refugees, which turn a blind eye to that and only look at vulnerability and those classes? And this system is great. It's absolutely correct that they have a higher success at rehabilitation, or at integration into Canada and resettlement. However, that is the one concern. Has there been any ways that you think we can utilize to address that concern?
So I'll point you to the question from Mr. Tillotson around the blended visa officer referred, or the BVOR model, which really tries to address that concern by saying we'll take a UNHCR referred refugee, drawing on the expertise in the field to identify the people who need resettlement on the basis of a series of internationally approved criteria, and then we will match them with the best integration tools we have, which is community sponsorship. So that BVOR program in Canada is reasonably modest beside our naming program, but that is the program that is being replicated in other parts of the world. So it does speak to the tension that you've just mentioned. Again, I'll come back to all of these programs have different policy features around who is being protected. And that's a different conversation about how to balance those different policy drivers. I think none of those policy drivers prevent us from looking at this broad form of community-based welcome and integration.
This is great, because I think you need both. You need people who want to help those that they know, that's essential, but you also want to not forget about those that are left behind. And there's a lot of groups that would like to sponsor anyone that obviously based on vulnerability, and that would be helpful. The other aspect, that it's almost on what Mr. Abultaf had stated, it's actually the opposite of that. In some cases, it's people want to go to regions like Vancouver or Toronto where they have community, but where the need is a lot of other places, like Atlantic Canada has done a special study. Atlantic Canada needs immigrants. They have a receding population in many cities and provinces. How can we encourage residents and communities there to sponsor refugees like this and then help them settle and help them establish roots there? Have there been successful models or organizations that have done that we can emulate?
Absolutely, and I think I'll point to the number I mentioned. 400 Canadian communities have engaged in sponsorship coast to coast just in the last 2.5 years. By contrast, our government-assisted refugees have been resettled to about 32 cities across the country. They go to the major urban centers. So one of the things sponsorship lets us do is diversify the range of communities who can support refugees, because they're not as dependent on professionalized services. You don't need a language school as long as your group comes up with some plan to teach language. So you can be very creative in what that looks like. The government has to be satisfied that it's a responsible plan, but it's not contingent on a big language school being downtown Toronto, for example. So it addresses also that need, not only in Canada. Australia is very serious about this model for the same reasons of trying to deal with depopulation of rural communities, and there's lots of success stories in Canada.
Would it be a good idea to perhaps prioritize those communities that have an abundant need as opposed to others, so we can, because Canada is lucky, we're one of the few countries in the world where we have more of a demand for sponsored refugees than we actually have the ability to bring in and settle under levels, which is unique to pretty much any country in the world. So would it be better to perhaps incentivize or prioritize, those that need them the most and those in those vital areas?
It's an interesting suggestion. I think what it does is ask us to consider a different policy problem and see whether this would be a solution. So the destining decisions now have not been based on meeting the economic needs of Canada from a population perspective. The policy drivers have been around family reunification or humanitarian stream, or what are we trying to do in this global displacement crisis, and how can we leverage communities to do it? I think there could be some risks in terms of prioritizing particular areas, particular parts of the country. Right now, there's a tremendous outpouring of interest in the program, so I'd hesitate to quash that by suggesting we're only going to engage communities in certain parts of the country. But it's interesting, and I know the Atlantic Immigration Pilot is likewise trying to think about how we use a traditional immigration policy fix to deal with some other challenges too. So it's an interesting suggestion.
That's, I think, the end. I want to thank you. Yesterday I was reading a newsletter from a United Church in Toronto, not in my riding, I wish it were. They have had 12, in the last 3 years, 12 successful sponsorships with teams, 7 second sponsorships from the same 12, 2 in process, and 4 new groups just forming to get ready to apply. One congregation of one church with 300 members doing over 20 sponsorships in 3 years. What I have found about them is now they're concerned about everything else, about employment, about housing, about transit, about the poor, about all of those things, because they've lived experience. So it's one church. Anyway, that's my sermon. We're going to suspend for a moment, and thank you for your time with us. Back to order. And thank you, witnesses, for waiting on that. We had a little bit of a slow start today, and we are continuing, as I said at the first part of the meeting, our study on migration challenges and opportunities for Canada in the 21st century. It's a large study. It's really defined to look at what in the world is going on with respect to migration, and is Canada responding to it in the best possible ways. And so we're a little bit all over the map because we're looking at economic migration, forced migration, everything in between, and what is going on. And the gradually, I am hoping what will emerge is a comprehensive report that we can submit to Parliament and the government will pay attention to about making some changes to our overall response to migration. We're going to begin with Professor Macklin in Toronto because you're coming to us via teleconference. And in case we lose you, it's good to have you go first. Thank you again for coming to our committee again. You're a regular witness for us, and it's good to have you here.
Merci pour cette occasion.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you.
Represent the Canadian Association of Lawyers, and I will be making some submissions relevant to their position. I am open to discussing larger issues of immigration as well in response to questions. It is my understanding that a significant issue before the committee relates to the Safe Third Country Agreement, forced migration, irregular entrance, and so on. And so I thought I would actually begin by reminding this committee that in 2002, this very Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration addressed two issues that are relevant to current concerns and proposals about the Safe Third Country Agreement. And this was in anticipation of signing that agreement. And the first question that the committee addressed was why not have the Safe Third Country Agreement apply inland, that is, at inland offices and so on. And that issue was discussed at some length in the committee's proceedings, and here is what the committee said. The fact that inland claims are not covered is due, in part, to lessons that have been learned from the European experience. In implementing Safe Third Country regimes, some countries had to establish time-consuming and costly processes for inland claims. It is understandable that this government would like to avoid diverting resources to a procedure intended to establish the inland claimant's route to Canada, rather than using that time and money to actually decide their refugee claims. That's a quote from the committee's report in 2002. I would suggest to you that there's nothing about the current state of affairs that warrants a different answer to the question of whether one should attempt to apply the Safe Third Country Agreement inland or indeed along the full length of the Canadian border, which I understand has also been a subject of discussion. It was not feasible then. The committee recognized it. It's not feasible now. Secondly, the committee also addressed a concern raised by some experts who testified before it in December of 2002 that implementing the Safe Third Country Agreement at ports of entry along the land border would simply lead to more people trying to enter irregularly between designated border posts and possibly with the assistance of smugglers. I should say that that fear didn't seem to come to be realized, at least not until the last couple of years, although there's no evidence that I know of that suggests that there's any significant involvement of smugglers. But there certainly has been, in the last couple of years, a rise in irregular crossings. And here's what the committee had to say about the risk that the STCA might, in fact, generate irregular crossings between border posts. The committee recommends that, as part of the monitoring of the implementation of the agreement, the issues of irregular migration and people smuggling be closely watched. Should the agreement fail to decrease the number of claims being referred to the Immigration and Refugee Board, and should an increase in the number of what it called illegal, I'll call irregular entries to Canada be apparent, the government must be prepared to exercise its authority to suspend or terminate the agreement. So that's what the committee had to say in 2002. If, in fact, there was an increase in the number of irregular entries because of the agreement, the committee should be prepared to recommend to the government that it suspend or terminate the agreement. And really, I would just encourage this committee to consider heeding the recommendations of its predecessors. I think in the debates around this issue, I think it's important to think about what kind of problem does one want to solve here? Is the problem that one identifies irregular entries across the border? Or is the problem the arrival of people seeking refugee protection? If the problem is irregular entry, then I think everybody knows that irregular entry would pretty much evaporate overnight if the agreement was suspended, and that the obstacles to doing that, as I understand it, are political, if I can put it that way, not principled. If the objective is to stop refugee claimants from reaching Canada, and I understand then that the fear is that suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement will not achieve that goal because more people will show up at designated ports of entry to enter Canada as refugee claimants than currently cross irregularly. I have two responses to that. First, as an empirical matter, that's not obvious to me, given how well known, in particular, the Roxham Road crossing has become. If people want to enter Canada to claim refugee status from the United States, I think the publicity around Roxham Road is pretty clear. It's not obvious that suspending the agreement so that people could enter through regular ports of entry would lead to a significant spike in the number of entries. But secondly, and more importantly, I think, deterring refugee claimants from claiming refugee status in Canada is not actually a valid policy objective. Canada signed on to the Refugee Convention in 1969, and it did so voluntarily. No one twisted Canada's arm. Nobody forced it to sign the Refugee Convention. And when it did sign it, it promised the international community that if people reached our borders and met the refugee definition, then they would be protected. So when people ask for refugee protection, they're simply asking Canada to fulfill its promise, which is a promise that's not contained in a tweet by the Prime Minister or anything like that. It's a promise contained in an international convention. If you reach our borders and you meet the refugee definition, we won't return you to a place where you might fear persecution. So that's really what I'd like to start with respect to this debate around irregular entries. There's more to say, and I'm happy to answer questions. In respect of the difficulties processing refugee claims now and the additional resource demands that imposes, I acknowledge that there are increased resource demands. Not all of them are due to events in the last couple of years around irregular entries. Some of them are the result of prior policy changes under an earlier government that led to thousands of cases being in a backlog and that could not be addressed because effectively the Immigration and Refugee Board was starved of resources. Those legacy cases are a problem, but not a problem because of a regular border crossing. And perhaps in closing, I'll just shift course a little bit, knowing that your mandate is broader than refugees, to just say this. A recent report indicated that refugees over time perform as well or better than native-born Canadians as economic actors. That is to say, after about 25 years, their income earnings actually surpass those of native-born Canadians. Why do I mention this? I think it's important to consider in the way we talk about refugees and other immigrant classes that there's an implicit hierarchy, that people who are admitted because they have a well-founded fear of persecution are in some sense going to be inferior as immigrants to others, that people admitted as economic immigrants are the better immigrants, and family class lies somewhere in between. I only want to point out that the empirical evidence about economic attainments doesn't seem to sustain that, And frankly, even if there was a slight difference in the economic performance over time, what's remarkable is how little a difference there is. That is to say, despite the extraordinary efforts that are put into our immigration system to sift through who we think will be the best economic actors and to admit refugees out of a sense of humanitarianism, if not a sense of rectifying injustice, that actually they all do just fine. And maybe that's an important message to take forward in thinking about how to improve our immigration and refugee policies going forward. To recognize that the categories that we put people into does not fully comprehend who they are. Refugees are also people who work hard. Family class members might have also been fleeing persecution. Economic actors might also have relatives here. The categories into which we put them don't comprehend who they are and certainly don't exhaust or predict the contributions that they make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go to Professor Purkey first because you came the farthest.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to thank you for the invitation to appear here. It is a privilege. I am a lawyer by training. In fact, Professor Macklin was my master's advisor years ago. And many years ago, I also worked here at the Department of Justice. I am also a professor of legal studies at the University of St. Jerome's in Waterloo, where my research focuses on protracted refugee situations and forced migration in an international context, so moving a little bit away from what you have seen this afternoon. And I think perhaps the starting point for my comments is a recognition that migration, human migration, is both necessary to individuals and to states and inevitable. The drive to seek out a place where one can live and work in dignity, where one can create a secure future for one's family, is stronger than any restrictionist policies. Indeed, the only truly effective way to manage these movements is to increase the number and variety of legal pathways to migration and focus on facilitation rather than restriction. Every individual has the right to live a dignified, secure life, and Canada, as a member of the international community, has a role to play, and one might even say an obligation to assist in this. Now, between Canada's refugee determination system and our private sponsorship program, as you've heard, Canada is clearly a leader in terms of domestic refugee processing. But Canada also has an opportunity today to be a leader in terms of international refugee governance. But if we are to do so, then there are a few points that I think we need to pay attention to. So my first comment pertains to the issue of responsibility sharing. However exemplary our system, the number of refugees resettled to Canada is insignificant compared to both the absolute number of refugees seeking protection and then perhaps more importantly to the number of refugees that find protection or that find some form of protection in developing countries. At our peak, we resettled 47,000 refugees, but this pales in comparison to the millions of refugees that we find in Lebanon, in Bangladesh, in Kenya, and in Turkey. We benefit from the generosity of these states and from the reality that most refugees will seek and obtain some form of protection within their region of origin. The system, however, is not sustainable without substantial ongoing assistance. And this assistance can take many different forms. It can be financial aid, it can be development grants, support to UNHCR, and increased numbers of resettlement. But whatever its form, as part of the global system of responsibility sharing, Canada and other states of the global north need to increase our assistance and ensure that our assistance is effective. Some of the strategies that could be used in order to achieve this goal include, for instance, guaranteeing aid over a longer funding cycle so that host states and international organizations are able to plan, to invest, and to strategize over more than a 2 to 3 to 4 year period. Similarly, support obviously needs to be provided to not only to refugees, but to the communities that host and support them. And perhaps most critically, the absolute level of assistance needs to be increased to address the consistent UNHCR budget shortfalls, which mean that many refugees end up not receiving the aid which they need and to which they are entitled. An Oxfam report in sort of a timely coincidence, was released earlier this week that noted that Canada's international assistance spending is at a near historic low. Only 0.26% of gross national income, as opposed to the UN's aid target of 0.7%. Through the fortunate accident of geography, the fact that we live on a very big island, and through the effective use of deliberate policies of deterrence, the global north, and North America in particular, has managed to largely outsource its refugee protection obligations. But this isn't sustainable over the long term. And this leads me to my second point, which as a lawyer is perhaps my pet project, which has to do with law and with rights. If Canada is to be a leader in the global refugee governance, it must espouse and promote a law and rights-based approach. In recent years, we've seen what is often referred to as a thinning of international refugee law. And perhaps the best example of this is indeed the Global Compact for refugees. The compact has its benefits, but ultimately it is a voluntary agreement that imposes no legal obligations on states. Consequently, there is a risk that the non-binding compact will undermine the existing legal framework under the 1951 Refugee Convention by prioritizing charity and humanitarian-based understandings of refugee protection and assistance as opposed to the existing law-based understanding. States cannot be allowed to use the Global Compact to pay lip service to the principles of international cooperation and responsibility sharing, while ultimately offering little in way of defined commitments or concrete results, and at the same time failing to meet their existing human rights obligations. Similarly, the increased use by states of bilateral arrangements, such as safe third country agreements, has the potential to undermine the existing multilateral legal framework, which is critical to an effective response to forced migration, being as it is a challenge that is international in both scope and nature. As a leader, Canada should reaffirm its commitment to the international legal regime. And that not only includes, to the international regime that not only ensures and protects the rights of refugees, but ensures and protects the rights of all human beings. And this includes, for instance, continuing to advocate for the ratification of international refugee and human rights agreements, and ensuring that we lead by example, for instance, by ratifying the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons, to which we are not a party, and by rethinking the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the United States. My third point pertains to the connected issues of pathways to migration and durable solutions. In perhaps the greatest tragedy of the current international system, millions of lives are being spent in protracted limbo, where refugees and other forced migrants survive in temporary, insecure situations without legal status or the full benefits of the rights to which they are entitled. The loss and the waste of human potential is staggering. To this end, states must be called upon to think creatively about offering alternative pathways for migration and complementary protection, for instance, through educational opportunities and through alternative work programs. And this in addition to the three durable solutions of resettlement, repatriation, and local integration. But if we are to do this, it is also critical that these approaches do not render the status of migrants and refugees even more insecure than they are today, and do not undermine the strength and certainty of citizenship. Thus, we must ensure that state policies and practices respect the inherent rights and dignity of refugees and migrants despite their status as non-citizens. And we must continue to recognize the essential role that legal status and citizenship plays, as well as individual agency and legal, economic, and physical integration in the search for durable solutions. My closing comment has to do with the fact that we are facing an increasing challenge on the international front. The increasing number of nationalist, populist political movements in the world today poses a huge challenge to those of us who seek an international system of migration governance. But it is my hope as an advocate as a lawyer, and particularly as a Canadian citizen, that the Canadian government will take the opportunity that is presented to it and use this time, use this chance to lead in this way and in the terms of the international community, not only in the domestic context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Liu.
Thank you. I want to applaud the committee for undertaking this study, and thank you for your invitation. My name is Jamie Liu. I am a refugee lawyer and an associate professor from the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. In my limited time today, I am submitting 3 recommendations for your consideration. And the first is to repeal Section 117(9)D of the regulations. I am providing to the committee a written copy of research co-authored with 2 other lawyers that calls for this repeal, which is a regulation that excludes a member of the family class, a family member that was not disclosed or examined before the sponsor came to Canada. The regulation imposes a lifetime bar to refugees and other migrants from sponsoring their family due to non-disclosure of a family member that has nothing to do with fraud in 90% of the cases that we examined. Tragic reasons like an assumed death of a child leads to permanent family separation. This regulation is overbroad and unnecessary given other tools in the immigration legislation. I invite the members to review this paper and consider this impact on refugees and Canada's long-standing commitment to family reunification. My second recommendation deals with the Refugee Protection Framework and what it should look like. And it should not look at its overseas activities separate from the Inland Protection Scheme. Canada's focus should not be focused so much on how the requests for refugee protection come to Canada. Much of the public discussion surrounding the issue of managing our border has been to cast resettled refugees as good, law-abiding people waiting in line, while those coming to our borders are those that are queue jumpers, lawbreakers, and less deserving. And the government has a role in shaping the way that migrants are seen in public through policy and laws. And rather than talking about refugee protection in the resettlement context as the legitimate way, and those coming inland as a means to discourage, we are sending a damaging message that is not aligned with our international legal obligations, as Professor Macklin outlined. I encourage the committee to think about refugee protection and the effects and links that the resettlement process has with the inland protection system. I'm therefore recommending that reforms would allow migrants to go to official ports of entry, putting trust in our well-oiled system rather than crafting makeshift border posts. I have recommended this to the committee in the past and again provided by written submissions to the committee that I provided in July. My third recommendation is surrounding the issue of statelessness. I want to draw the committee's attention to the fact that the UNHCR states that there are over 10 million stateless people all over the world. And recognizing this as a global problem, the UNHCR commenced a 10-year campaign in 2014 called I Belong to end statelessness by 2024. Stateless persons have difficulty accessing healthcare, education, and social services. Without status, stateless persons cannot work. They are at risk of being detained, and because there are sometimes no prospect of removing the person to another country, they can be indefinitely held in immigration detention. In other cases, they are removed to a place where they suffer further hardship because they are stateless. I want to discuss how the lack of citizenship may be the cause of displacement and forced migration. And indeed, the denial or the stripping of citizenship is a political tool that encourages discrimination, oppression, and in the case of, for example, the Rohingya in Myanmar, genocide. While it may be clear, for example, for the Rohingya that some stateless persons may also be refugees, in many situations, stateless persons do not meet the requirements in law to qualify for refugee protection. Canada has provided some relief in the form of policy guidelines for permanent resident applications on humanitarian grounds, and also the ability to apply to the minister to grant citizenship to a stateless person in the Citizenship Act. These 2 legal mechanisms, however, are an exercise of discretionary power that is seen as an exception to the rule and is an avenue that should not be used as a means of circumventing the normal immigration or citizenship process. While there are potential avenues existing within the citizenship and immigration framework by which some stateless persons may gain status, for many, they simply do not qualify or are at the whim of pure discretion. As a leader in refugee protection, Canada can also become a leader in providing protection for stateless persons by creating a holistic legal framework by which stateless persons can have a true chance at accessing not only permanent status, but citizenship as a durable solution. Canada can begin by legally defining and investigating the depth of statelessness in Canada. My recommendation is to identify and track stateless persons while creating legal mechanisms geared towards providing a pathway for citizenship dedicated to stateless persons. Second, it is important to understand that Canada is a signatory to the 1961 Statelessness Convention, but as Professor Perky mentioned, not a party to the 1954 Statelessness Convention. The 1961 Convention guides us in preventing statelessness, but the 1954 Convention establishes positive obligations. Arguably, aspects of both conventions are becoming customary international law. And Canada has a stateless population of its own, which it should address. More research needs to be conducted with regards to how Indigenous persons who don't have citizenship want to be recognized as citizens, as well as stateless persons who have a dominant and effective link to Canada by, for example, being resident in Canada for a significant portion of time should be given a pathway to citizenship. I point out Canada's international obligations here because there's been recent talk about eliminating birthright citizenship. I've conducted research in other countries where birthright citizenship is not present and can attest there are several reasons why this policy should not see the light of day. This discussion is fueled by the fear migrants may be engaging in birth tourism. Existing data, however, shows only 0.1% of total births can be characterized as such. This is not a problem worth eliminating birthright citizenship for. Second, if we're going to talk about efficient management of the administrative processing of citizenship applications, such a policy would demand more tax dollars towards a complicated process because everybody would have to apply for citizenship. Proving citizenship will be more difficult, and this policy will cause or create greater numbers of stateless persons within our borders. I leave you with this. My father was stateless before he immigrated to Canada. He was lucky because at the time he qualified as a low-skilled worker. He would not qualify today under today's system, and I was born on the heels of him obtaining citizenship in Canada. But had the government of the time not changed the residency requirements from 5 to 3 years, I would have been born in Canada while my father was stateless. If birthright citizenship did not exist, I may have not become a Canadian. And I am living proof that welcoming stateless persons to Canada with the conferral of citizenship is the best way to build a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you have Professor Macklin as well?
I
has
teach your
tentacles
material in class
everywhere.
quite a bit.
There's this brand that kind of goes across the country. We're going to begin with Mr. Sarai.
Thank you to all three of you. It's always insightful to hear from Professor Macklin and as well as you. Ms. Berkey, you talked about the safe third-party agreement and that it's maybe perhaps time for it to go. Being liberals and being a liberal-minded person, we are all very liberal in terms of refugee settlement. But once you get in this job, you also learn that there's levels and there's certain amounts that you can absorb. And if you take too many, then people have a queue of years and years and years, and that becomes a challenge. There's also the argument that you brought up of a rising level of populism and refugee sentiments arise, and that usually happens when you have an abundance coming in really quickly and they're not able to integrate or perhaps settle, and certain groups will rise and use that as an excuse for unemployment or other small issues and pick them up. And usually the best way, and Canada has been very successful at that, is that we've absorbed the amount that we have taken in. So what's your alternative if the safe third-party agreement was taken and was removed? I fear that floodgates may open due to policies that are prevalent in the U.S. right now, and we wouldn't be able to control much, even though now we have a challenge as well. What would be the alternative to that? Would we just allow everyone to cross over, process everyone, and then do it? It'd just be a huge burden, and you'd be taking probably over 25, 30 months, 40 months to process their refugee claims. And in that time, they're starting to have families lose roots from where they're coming, establishing roots here, and then it de facto becomes almost impossible to remove them if they're in fact not genuine refugees. So what's your suggestions on how to, what mechanism could be better?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I will refer to Professor Macklin's comments on this as well, in that we actually don't have any real evidence that doing away with the Safe Third Country Agreement would, in fact, create any huge influx. We've had a substantial influx of people over the past few years, but there's no indication that removing the agreement entirely would change that. Those people are still coming, and will continue to come even under the current agreement. I think with regards to the idea of integration and perhaps the pushback against a large number of people, I think we have to also keep in mind how many people we're talking about. This is not 1 million people crossing the border. This is not what we see in Turkey. This isn't even what we saw in Germany and in Austria. That the numbers are actually, if you look at them in an absolute context, they're not that big. They're big for us, but we are a very large country. We are a wealthy country. If we devote the resources to it, we have the capacity to integrate substantially more people than we are. In fact, we need to integrate whether they're refugees or immigrants. There have been any number of studies fairly recently that have talked about the challenges we have in terms of creating a workforce. Now, obviously, we prefer to choose who comes in, but doing away with the Safe Third Country Agreement also doesn't remove the security checks that would be there. We will be doing all of those, so you're not going to be getting, quote-unquote terrorists coming in. But with regards to the issue of processing time, again, it's a question of resources. If we devote more resources, we can process faster. We were able to do it with the Syrians when they came in.
So, the current flow of irregular crossings, are a lot of them, they're getting visas to the United States and then they're coming over, and I think in the 30% range is what they're currently being accepted as refugees. But you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, undocumented workers and people without proper status in the U.S. that at any time, if the U.S. changes their policy, could be potential refugees that could just come over. That's the issue that I'm more concerned about. The others are kind of coming in, and it's not as big of a number as people think they are. But that's the alarming factor, which previously, probably prior to this current regime, was not something that Canadians worried about. But currently, it's a realistic fear, and that's why I'm asking and how we can curb that. I'll go on to Ms. Macklin. I want to commend you on your comments about the economic empirical data of a refugee versus an economic immigrant. It is so true. If you look even historically, whether it's Jews that left during the Holocaust, they become some of the most successful immigrants in the United States and Canada. If I look back at some of my parents' friends from India, that during the India and Pakistan partition refugee, some of the greatest and wealthiest and most industrious and entrepreneurial people in India and around the world that came out of that were from the refugees because they started from nothing. So I commend you. It'd actually be very helpful if you had some empirical data to show us about Canadian refugees that have settled and how well they've done. I had recalled remembering somebody doing it on the boat people that came in Halifax in the late 80s, I believe 1988, and they studied how well they did, and I don't know how many were millionaires, how many had employed others, but if you can have some more empirical data that you might be privy to and forward those, I'd be greatly appreciative.
The study I referenced is actually one that the government itself did. So it was reported in the media, but the evidence itself is within the government's archive of data.
Perfect. So I'll ask the analyst to provide that. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Elias Hassi, who has given me questions.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank everyone for their incredible advocacy today. I should add that I'm just a visitor. I'm not regularly a part of this. I'm a temporary resident, as my colleague says, on this committee. But the issue that I wanted to ask you about, both Professor Purkey and Professor Liu, is on the Convention on the Status of the Stateless. Just out of curiosity, what are the impediments that seem to get in our way of ratifying this convention? Because I note that the Human Rights Council has brought this up. They've made several recommendations to us. So what is the policy rationale for us, or has been the policy rationale from the bureaucracy, I suppose, that we're not signing on to this?
Sure.
Very briefly.
My understanding is that the difference between the 1961 and the 1954 conventions are that The one that we haven't ratified, it imposes positive obligations. So it really means that Canada has to take positive steps in terms of creating a pathway for citizenship for stateless persons and actively taking steps to identify, to track, to define, and to provide a pathway for permanent status in Canada. Canada, I think, is reluctant to do this because it really means that there isn't flexibility in the future to talk about the ways in which we might want to create a more flexible or less sticky, I guess, citizenship. And we've seen, discussions in policy and revisions in our Citizenship Act, which have in the past created concerns among advocates like myself about whether or not citizenship should be as permanent as it is. And because of, recent discussions about the idea of citizenship and whether or not this should be who qualifies for citizenship, who's deserving, and how we can strip citizenship away. These kinds of potential policy actions that governments may want to take are restricted further by being a signatory to this convention. I think that Canada should really take this as an opportunity to be a leader in this. The UNHCR is embarking on this campaign, and Canada's been known internationally to lead in the refugee context, and I don't see how this could be any different with regards to statelessness, and I think this is a really good time and an opportunity to incorporate in our protection regime a way in which we not only define and track stateless persons, but to identify ways in which we can provide dedicated protection paths for stateless persons. And obviously, the first step to do that would be to become a signatory and ratify the convention, but I think Canada can do it without doing that as well. But, my preference would be to become a signatory to this.
I need to end you there. Thank you, and I think that we will take that and ask for a note on the actual differences. Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your presentations today as well. Just a couple of points of interest that I found. Your statelessness, Mr. Liu, was something that I think was important, 10 million across the world, and you referred to the number of stateless in Canada. Do you have numbers on?
A 2016 census was that people who had self-identified as stateless was almost 4,000 people, but this is, again, people who have self-identified. It wasn't, a full, broad study. I think it's really unclear whether how many stateless persons there are in Canada, and obviously people who are stateless may not want to become identifiable to the government for reasons of becoming removable or for coming to the attention of the government. So it's really unclear, and I think the government has an opportunity to, use their resources to track and identify stateless persons and provide some pathways for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a very good point. I just wanted to look at, and those are the legal ID ones that you talked about, and how many of them, 4,000 is quite a number, given the fact that, as you pointed out, there could be many others for many reasons not wanting to declare themselves. And Ms. Prickey, you talked about the aid program, the guaranteeing of aid over a longer period of time. Certainly, can you just elaborate on that a bit? I mean, I know it would probably provide more predictability. Is that the major reason for going there?
To a great extent, it is about predictability. It's also about consistency. Even I think about my students who want to work in international aid, and yet you can only get a 1 or 2 year contract because your job is dependent on the aid or the funding cycle. It also means that a huge amount of effort is put into writing grant proposals and spending time seeking new aid and competing in different organizations, different states competing against one another. So enabling a longer funding cycle because we realize that the challenges dealing with migration, these aren't things that are going to be solved in 6 months. They're not things that are going to be solved in a year. We need to be able to look ahead in order to create some degree of consistency.
Yeah, I know I was speaking with some people from the Food Grains Bank just yesterday in regards to your numbers, the 0.26% gross now and targets of 0.7, and it's exactly the numbers that they have as well.
Yep.
And so there's absolute dollars needed in some of those areas, and it would be a benefit to help with some of those pathways as well. very staggering. You referred to I made a note here, temporary living. The survival in those temporary living conditions is pretty staggering, and you use that as a pathways mechanism. Can you just elaborate on that some?
So it's one of the options that has been raised is looking at the idea of providing temporary protection to people, and that perhaps states would be more willing to offer protection if they didn't feel that there was going to be this permanent a permanent impact on their societies. I have some reservations about that because I think that ultimately our objective is to find durable solutions, and durable solutions are long-term, they're permanent, they allow people to settle and to integrate. At the same time, perhaps looking at temporary mechanisms is the least bad of some of the options. If you could give people at least some assurance that they had status and protection for a limited period of time and it didn't impact our longer term objectives, then at least you wouldn't have this constant feeling of insecurity for many people, this day to day, am I going to get deported, am I going to get returned to a country where I risk torture? It's not a perfect solution. Ideally, we want durable solutions. We want permanent solutions for everyone. We are not currently in a situation where that is possible.
Thank you. And Ms. Liu as well, I know from some of your readings, you mentioned Rohingya, and are there measures that you think we should be taking to support Rohingya more? I understand that you're supportive of, Canada stripping the citizenship of Ms. Sioux in that area, and can you just elaborate on that then as well, and what do you think we could do in those areas?
I mean, certainly Canada could think about resettling a number of Rohingya from refugee camps, for example, in Bangladesh, and Canada has obviously had a record in doing that. I think that is, one big step to support the weight of the burden that some countries in the region are feeling. Secondly, I think, really engaging with ASEAN and partners in Asia to talk about what is a durable solution within that region. And finally, providing, as Professor Perky mentioned, aid to the regions where Rohingya are. I think it is, imperative that we discuss the fact that some of these people are going to be living as stateless and refugees in some countries for many years. I personally met some Rohingya refugees in Malaysia who had been living there for 20 years. And this is not a durable solution because they don't have status, their children are not educated. I think Canada needs to have a more engaged conversation about what's happening in countries that are closer to the conflict.
Thanks. I know Ms. Kwan and I were at a camp this summer in Africa as well, where it was 27 years that the person had been in that camp, and she was now looking at her grandchildren in that camp as well, a very desperate situation. So I guess I'm just wondering if you feel that in relation to some of the programming that we do that it's important to look at the most persecuted people in these areas as people that we take in as refugees in Canada, as opposed to, say, which has been referred to as some of the economic immigrant refugees that we've seen as well.
Yeah, I certainly think that it's difficult to prioritize. I'm certainly not going to, judge the government in terms of how they come to that decision, but certainly the people that are living in the most, precarious of situations. I identified Rohingya as a population because the other thing is that they're stateless. They really, there is completely no recognition of their personhood anywhere. And so alongside, the genocide that's been recognized by this government, I think, this is, a perfect example of where our resettlement program could kick in, and also where Canada can engage in a conversation about what kind of assistance can be given to countries in that region.
I need to end there, sorry. Ms. Kwan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I thank all three of our witnesses for their very, very thoughtful presentations. I'm going to start with this issue, the Safe Third Country Agreement. Minister Blair, actually, a few weeks ago at a different committee, the Public Safety Committee, actually put on the public record in response to my colleague's, Matthew DeBay's question about whether or not the government will eliminate, eliminate applying the Safe Third Country Agreement to the entire border from their discussion and negotiations with the United States? The answer was no. So that is to say that the option of applying the Safe Third Country Agreement to the entire border is on the table as the government sits at the table when they renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement with the U.S. So I like to just ask for all three of you your comments about that and whether or not this is the right approach, or should we really just be on the record to say that this is not an option? I will start with you, Professor Macklin.
Well, I'm not going to repeat the reasons why I think it's an unprincipled response, but just from the perspective of practicality. Are we going to build a wall along the Canada-US border? Are we going to put sentries along the Canada-US border? How exactly does anybody imagine that you could actually implement this agreement across the full length of the Canadian border? And if you think, well, we'll just put them at Roxham Road and at Emerson, Manitoba, well, of course, then people are no longer going to try to enter at Roxham Road and Emerson, Manitoba. So it's just a completely unfeasible approach, not to mention who do you imagine will be standing on the other side of the US border waiting to receive people back? Right? The whole thing is just so impracticable that even if you aren't persuaded by the principled objections to it, I would think the pragmatic ones should carry some weight. If I may, let me just add one more point to this. There is the sense, a kind of short memory idea, that the Safe Third Country Agreement has always been in place. It has always ever been thus. But of course, it's only been in place for a dozen years. A dozen years ago, the norm was you can make a refugee claim at a port of entry, at the land border, at an airport, or at a seaport. Today, you can still make a refugee claim at an airport or a seaport. So the Safe Third Country Agreement is an exception to the norm. It's not the norm. And just to repeat, there's no evidence that if you were to revert to the status quo ante, the usual situation, that there would be a sudden rush to the border. I think if there's a concern amongst Canadians that there will be, I think it's the job of those who lead this country. It's a job of leadership to dispel the kind of negative information, the scapegoating, the misinformation. It isn't to just take it as given as a political fact around which one must organize one's policies. Thank you.
Ms. Liu? Professor
Thank
Liu?
you for your question. I think, the STC's original purpose was really to reduce the pressures faced by the IRB in terms of the number of claims being made at the time. And if you think about that policy reason why the STC was put in place, it obviously is failing. And so, as acknowledged by a member of the committee earlier today, there are people coming regardless of whether or not the STCA is in place or not. And I think the question should be, how do we manage the border in a planned, orderly, and compassionate way? And this, going back to Professor Macklin's comment about what is most practical, I think as well that we should really think about the fact that applying the Safe Third Country Agreement really means we're not meeting our international obligations when it comes to refugee protection. We cannot stand here and espouse, the way in which the world should be convening and talking about refugee protection when in our own backyard we're not complying with international obligations. And I've spoken at length in front of the committee before about the violations that are occurring, that people are being turned back to face risks in their home country and even hardship and trauma within the United States. I think finally I want to say that we should really trust our system. We have a well-oiled immigration system in place. We should use our official ports of entry instead of using these makeshift places and not complicate the matter. Ultimately, our obligations to process these claims, we shouldn't be focused on how people are coming and trying to stop them from coming. Let's, live up to our international obligations.
Thank you. And Professor Perky.
I'm not sure there is much of value that I can add, except that I would still reiterate the principled approach as well, in that the premise of the Safe Third Country Agreement is that the country that individuals are being returned to is, in fact, safe. And we have credible evidence that for many people right now, the U.S. is not a safe third country. And so that opens the door to really rethinking this agreement at its very fundamental purpose. Moreover, I would say that many of these bilateral agreements have the unfortunate side effect of pushing people into illegality. As Professor Macklin has said, if we are going to put border guards at Roxham, we will have people crossing through, fields in Calgary, fields outside of Calgary, fields outside of Edmonton. We will have people freezing in the snow because people will cross. People will come to seek safety. And we are simply pushing individuals into a more dangerous, more illegal situation by strengthening this particular, some might argue, inhumane policy.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. I think it's worth putting on the record over and over again this important point of view, which is why I asked the question, because I was quite alarmed to hear Minister Blair not very many weeks ago say this on the public record at the Public Safety Committee. Okay, I'm going to move on because the other piece related.
30 seconds.
Okay, statelessness, the action that governments should take. What is the remedy?
There should be a creation of legal mechanisms to provide pathways for permanent status, i.e. citizenship for stateless persons. We should be looking in detail about who are stateless, how we can provide some pathways for them and become a leader in this area of protection.
Thank you very much. We want a few minutes and an in-camera meeting, so we are going to thank you for your presence, and we have several things I want to follow up with you about, so you may hear from us again. As this study will go on for a little while. Thank you very much. We'll just suspend for a moment as we move to an in-camera meeting.